And good morning, Pretoria. My name is Vuyelwa. I'm going to be chairing this briefing session. I'm responsible for media management in Minister Nzimande's office. Ladies and gentlemen, we are meeting here, as the media advisory said, for the Minister to brief you on the report that came out of that investigation into the situation around student housing in South African universities. There is a statement the Minister is going to read. You all have copies, or you are about to have copies of it. We are going to try to read it as quickly as we can get through it. The information is quite important. I was particularly undecided about what to cut out to shorten it, but I think you will agree with me that the information is going to be quite helpful for your purposes afterwards. We have here in front of us the Minister, Dr. Nzimande, and to his left-hand side, we've got the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, Professor Aaron Rensbeck, and on the right-hand side, our DG in the department, Mr. Gwebs Konde. Pretoria, can we please link up with you just to get a sense of who is there and what is happening on your side?
We only have journalists here at this side. About 6 of them.
Okay, thanks, Professor. Is that you?
Yeah, it's Professor, sure.
Oh, Professor, you are saying we've got 6 journalists there?
Yes.
All right, we're struggling to hear you. The sound on your side seems to be a bit problematic.
Actually, we have about 3 journalists here and some members and officials from the department.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we are going to hand over to the Minister now. Minister, it's over to you.
Vuyelwa, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I'm going to read this statement because I believe that it's fairly important, and it's very helpful in terms of summarizing that thick book that is in front of you. So you will bear with me on that, so that we are able to provide this information. Once more, thanks for being here, both in Cape Town and in Pretoria. It is indeed my pleasure and privilege to release the much anticipated report of the one-person committee for the review of the provision of student housing in South African universities. After I was appointed Minister of Higher Education and Training in 2009, I visited a number of institutions as part of my orientation with the portfolio. During these visits, I must say it was glaringly apparent that student housing is a major problem in our public university system, and that something needed to be done urgently. The conditions of some of the student residences, both off and on campus, left much to be desired, and this can in part explain why there has been so much unhappiness related to accommodation in many campuses. Further exacerbating the problem has been a lack of supply of adequate and affordable student housing offered by universities, which in turn force students to rent substandard accommodation off campus. In some cases, the living conditions both on and off campus were not conducive for academic study, thus having a detrimental impact on the success and throughput rates of students at universities. The lack of sufficient and adequate on-campus housing has resulted in overcrowding, thereby jeopardizing students' academic endeavors and creating significant health and safety risks for them. From 2005 to 2010, universities reported a total of 39 incidents of student housing-related protests of varying intensity and scope, several of which were sparked by dissatisfaction with residents, maintenance, and facilities. Most of the protests were in historically black institutions. There were similar protests in 2011, and also in recent weeks there have been a handful of student protests linked to the desire for affordable and academically conducive student residences. In 2010, I appointed Professor Aaron Rensbeck, sitting next to me here, on my left this time, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, to lead a committee whose purpose was to assess the current provision of student accommodation and benchmark the South African universities against each other, as well as against international institutions operating in a similar environment. Furthermore, the committee had to determine the real need and assess the various models of provision of student housing, the various types of housing that can be provided, and the potential funding models which may assist in alleviating the problem. The committee was further required to ensure that the provision thereof in their suggestions must not in turn detrimentally affect the operating budgets of the universities in future. Professor Rensbeck completed this task in September 2011 and presented a report to ourselves. I'm only releasing the report now because it would not have benefited the universities to merely state the obvious and present the report without coming up with a plan as a ministry, with a plan of action about how the challenges in the report would be addressed. As a result, I will also share with you how the ministry aims to address the key challenges identified in this report. The report does indeed confirm that there are major backlogs in the provision of student accommodation, and that in some instances students are living in appalling conditions. Many of the institutions have not been able to make sufficient investments in maintaining their infrastructure, and far too few students can actually be accommodated. It is clear that massive investments are required to address the backlog that currently exists. Student enrollment in the residential university system for 2010 was 535,433. That, by the way, excludes UNISA, just to remind ourselves. It's residential universities. And this number is expected to grow at a rate of over 2%. And our academic enrollment target for the cycle 2011 to 2013 suggests an average growth of 2.8%. The number of beds available at residential universities in 2010 totaled 107,598, or 20% of the total contact student enrollment. In other words, 80% of the university students in contact universities are not in university-owned accommodation. This means that, sorry, that's just what I've explained. By way of example, take a student that resides at home in Mamelodi and travels to and from either the University of Witwatersrand or the University of Johannesburg between 3 to 4 hours a day to attend classes using public transport, e-tolling permitting. The estimated distance between Mamelodi and Johannesburg is only 82 kilometers apart. It's no coincidence that many students experiencing these conditions, especially at first year, fail to cope with the demands of academia, given the time spent commuting. While it is clear that every student cannot be accommodated at university residences, research evidence suggests that being housed in a safe, well-managed residence does advantage students, particularly those from poorer backgrounds, as they do not have to spend hours commuting to and from the university. Affordable student accommodation allows these students to focus their energy on their academic endeavors, thereby improving their chances of success. Nationally, the national demographic profile of students provided with accommodation in universities is close to that of the national demographic profile of the country. As might be expected, there are more female than male students accommodated, which is 55% of the total students that are accommodated. Most disconcerting, though, is that only 5.3% of first-year students, those arguably in greatest need of accommodation, are in residences. This is of serious concern to us. The department will be encouraging universities to ensure that preference is given to first-year students so that they can be supported in their academic endeavors. It is also easier to develop special programs for academic support when you know where students reside. I must say, Professor Rensburg, when I was reading this report about this statistic, I really became scared. What would have happened to myself if, as a first-year student in 1976, if I didn't have university accommodation? It's quite scary. Of particular concern also is the severe shortage of accommodation for students with disabilities, as well as the big differences in what facilities are provided at different institutions. Some campuses have no residences suitable for students who require wheelchair-accessible buildings, rooms, and bathroom facilities. Even more disturbing was the discovery that many students at our institutions actually go hungry. Only 41% of campuses have dining halls, of which 40% are self-catering and 19% have both options. The committee found that some students go for days without a meal, and sadly this was found to be a particularly serious problem among first-year students, including even those with bursaries. So partly or largely this explains why 40% of your first-year NSFAS students actually fail. First attempt. I'm deeply concerned about this state of affairs. Students need to have access to and funding for proper meals. Hunger and poor nutrition are believed to affect attendance, concentration levels during lectures, and ultimately academic performance, which in turn leads to high dropout rates. Hungry students cannot be expected to fare well academically. And for this reason, I want to appeal to all vice-chancellors to ensure that students in their residences have access to and funding for proper meals. For those who prefer to prepare their own food, then residences should have proper kitchenettes. In any case, it is my own view that students don't go to university to cook. They go to university to study. I'm just trying to think that if you are to cook for yourself, it means you must have a hot plate, some of which I'm sure would be a primer stove even these days. And you must have utensils, and you must spend time on this. Therefore, the proposed minimum standards in the report provide guidelines on proper meals and catering facilities to ensure that students do eat properly. There are at least 554 student residences or housing complexes in our universities, including 93 dining hall facilities, serving the 49 campuses of the 22 universities. This matter of dining, by the way, again, it's something that has been of concern to us, which the report underlines, that I have been concerned about this thing of closing down of dining halls as an increasing trend over the last decade or so in our institutions. A quarter of all residential infrastructure at universities is unsatisfactory or in poor condition. Students in some residences are using bathrooms as kitchens, since there are no kitchen facilities. Around a quarter of all infrastructure, fixtures, fittings, and dining hall facilities are assessed by the universities concerned to be in an unsatisfactory or poor condition. By the way, this is not a thumbsuck because Professor Rensbeck and those who were assisting him literally visited all our 23 institutions on these matters. The value of the current national maintenance and refurbishment backlog is 2.5 billion rands. Furthermore, if the existing residence stock is to be modernized to render the residences fit for purpose, then a further 1.9 billion rands is required. This means that only taking care of the current backlog without adding any new infrastructure will require 4.4 billion rands as at September 2011. The average cost to build and provide a single bed is estimated at 240,000 rands at 2010 prices. This cost includes all the necessary standard fittings and furniture, kitchenette, and social space that a student accommodation is expected to have. It should be noted that the actual cost differs considerably from one institution to the next, depending on the location of the institution and whether the institution has its own land for development or not. It is estimated that the 2010 residence bed shortage was approximately 195,815, and this grows yearly with the expansion of the system. The estimated shortage in 2013 will be 207,800 beds. These estimates are premised on the provision of residence accommodation for 80%, not for 100%, of full-time contact student enrollments on campuses, where off-campus accommodation is unsuitable and or unavailable, especially in rural universities, and for 50% of full-time contact students enrollments on campuses where limited off-campus accommodation is both available and suitable. The cost of overcoming this shortage over a period of 10 years is estimated at 147 billion rands over 15 years, including escalation for building and increased intake, growing at an average of 2% per annum. Now, the private sector, as many of us would know, is a significant contributor and stakeholder in the provision of accommodation to university students in South Africa, as is the case internationally. Leaving aside those students who live at home or in their own accommodation, it is estimated that the number of student beds currently made available by both small and large-scale private provider in South Africa is close to 10% of the total full-time contact enrollment at universities in 2010. However, the study indicates that the provision of private student accommodation is unregulated in South Africa, unlike in many other parts of the world, allowing widespread exploitation of students and exposure of students to various types and levels of risk. Now, there's a gremlin there in my statement. The point there we are making is that we nevertheless need to be very careful about the role of the private sector, as it does come with risks of exploitation, especially if left unregulated. Myself, some of the residences, organized by universities from private providers, they really leave a lot to be desired. They are just not providing the proper academic environment. And by the way, there's a lot of tenderpreneuring now on this front, including the buying of students, by the way, to lead protests, to want to go to particular complexes because the owners of those complexes have bought SRC leaders, a matter that we are going to be going into in more detail. On the recommendations, excuse me, the report makes key recommendations in 8 areas: residence admissions and allocations policy, minimum standards for student housing and accommodation, private student housing and accommodation, residence management and administration, role of residences in the academic project, financing of student housing and funding of student accommodation, condition of residence infrastructure, future planning. You can, by the way, and we invite you to actually read on this in some more detail in the report itself. My department has engaged deeply with this report and very closely. An immediate response to begin addressing the infrastructure backlog has been implemented. As the Chinese say, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first mile. So this is the first mile. An amount of 3.8 billion rand has been allocated as an infrastructure and efficiency grant for universities over the next 2 financial years. Out of this, 847 million has been exclusively earmarked for student housing, and 743 million of this for historically disadvantaged institutions, deliberately biased towards those because that's where we have got some huge problems. Universities in urban areas, for instance, can get complexes that are somehow better as compared to rural universities, for instance, where some students are even staying in shacks. However, this amount is not enough to address the backlogs in the system. To augment the funding that I've just mentioned, the department is currently in discussions with the Public Investment Corporation, the PIC, about setting up a special fund for university accommodation. It is anticipated that the fund will be operational in the next 3 to 4 months and will offer preferential rates to universities. However, institutions do not have to wait for the legal establishment of the fund, but can start applying immediately for student housing loans. The department is also planning a workshop with all universities to work through the recommendations of the report and to specifically take forward the guidelines on minimum standards for student accommodation and finalize these for implementation across the system. And by the way, we are also hopeful that student accommodation is likely to feature in the expanding infrastructure investment by government, as announced by the President. We urge universities to engage with the report and start implementing the recommendations at the institutional level while national policies and guidelines are being finalized. For example, we are indeed going to be developing a national residence policy and also taking measures to regulate private accommodation that is being offered to university to ensure that it's not just a money-making scheme, but those who actually get into contracts with universities to provide student accommodation meet minimum standards, as it happens in other countries. Let me then finally take this opportunity to thank Professor Rensburg and the team that supported him for the excellent report, which will assist the ministry and the department in addressing the housing needs of students at our institutions through different interventions and initiatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much. Now we are going to open up the floor for questions, ladies and gentlemen. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Minister. It's Paula Charles from E-News. My first question goes to the Vice-Chancellor. Which was the worst university, or at least area or province? And can you describe some of the things you saw that shocked you? And then to the Minister, in terms of your minimum standards, I know it will be detailed in the report, but if you can just describe some of the things that you expect should be in every residence, what are these minimum standards? And then when regulating the private student housing, how will you go about that? Will you create legislation? What will give you the power to regulate that private housing?
Yes, Caiaphas from Sunday Times. Forgive my ignorance here. On where you say the average cost to build and provide a single bed is estimated at 240,000 rand. I just need clarification on that. What do we mean by a single bed? Do we mean a single room or just to fit a single bed? And why is it costing 240,000 rand? Sounds a bit excessive. Expensive.
Sorry, it's next. Thanks. Jannie van Rensburg, SABC Radio. I also just want to know whether it contains in this report, we've seen in the last few days protest actions around residences and that kind of stuff, where it seems that students who fail their first year and stay on place increasing pressure on available residents. Has that been at all addressed in this report?
From Eyewitness News. I spoke to Professor Jonathan Jansen yesterday in particular about the Walter Sisulu incident, and he called on for political leadership from government, and he said that he feels that government is taking a stand, or at least is not taking a stand in terms of allowing these protests. I just want to get your comment on that, please.
Okay, you can switch off the mic next to you. Can I give this opportunity to the panel to respond to those questions? Minister?
Okay. Thanks very much, Minister. I think it's also incumbent on me before responding to express sincere appreciation. I think we may underestimate the significance and the importance of this report, especially against the background of a range of extraordinary challenges facing the university system. And in the chairperson's introduction, I draw attention to those issues, but I just want to express appreciation, and obviously also to express appreciation to the team that enabled us to put together a pioneering report for South Africa, but also a report which I'm confident that future investigations will look to, will use as a reference and a benchmark. So it's a pioneering investigation. Turning to some of the questions, throughout the report we have for you in full color photographs beginning on page 49 and going on probably up to page 91. So interspersed right up to page 92, you will get, if you like, a picture of the state of residences. And you will notice when you will have had the opportunity to review the report that this varies. This picture varies across our institutions. And let's be clear that we have outstanding practice. We have benchmark practices amongst our institutions. We also have extraordinary variance within institutions. So within an institution you may have a benchmark practice, but also a real bad practice at the same time. And so it's impossible for me to pick out particularly bad instances. I think you should just have a look. We do indicate which place or which residence or which institution the photograph has been taken from. And so I think my response, Paula, to your question would be outstanding practice, benchmark practice that's recorded in here, but also very, very bad practice. And those bad practices, the Minister has referred to some of them. I can just think of one that really stands out, or two that really stand out. One, a situation in KwaZulu-Natal where a worker hostel for sugarcane workers had been converted into a student residence. And the conditions are quite appalling. On the occasion that the team was visiting this particular residence, the food had been moved from the main campus to this residence, had arrived cold, and from the impression that we had of the food, was rotten. So there is a case of really poor practice and poor governance, poor management of the situation, poor conditions. But I think we need to recognize that in many respects universities are desperate. They're desperate to find any possible solution to providing accommodation, and often it's not suitable. Another instance is where an institution had gone into a lease agreement with local, call it downtown, the term you use, ministers, complexes, downtown flats, call them flats, apartment blocks that had been hijacked, presumably, previously, were now back with the original owners, and were now repurposed for purposes of providing student accommodation. Again, there are pictures of that particular facility, so-called Lonsdale Hotel, and it's absolutely appalling situation. Again, I simply want to refer to some of the photographs that we have taken to demonstrate this. On the other hand, if I'm just opening here on page 200 of the report, where we see really, we see some really good pictures, good image. Again, so there's varying images in the system, and we have to get the bad practice out, root out the bad practice in the system, and use the benchmark practices as a point of reference. And that's really where the estimate from universities then come in. Twofold: one, backlog maintenance, and here we talk physical building, infrastructure, fittings, and so on and so forth. The minister refers to that number in his report. If I recall, we're speaking of 2.5 billion in backlog maintenance. Here we're talking of buildings that are all close to falling apart, not maintained for, this is on-campus facilities now, not maintained for probably 2-3 decades. And then, of course, turning some of this accommodation into more fit-for-purpose accommodation, an estimate of 1.9 billion to fix that. But I think it's important to, as we try and acknowledge or draw attention to in the report, Minister, that buildings is one thing, facilities is one thing, but governance is another. Management of residents and governance of those residences, ensuring that residences are what we in the report call learning, living communities. So they're not just living communities. We must make every effort to turn them into learning and living, or if you like, living and learning communities. And so the point that the Minister draws attention to in his statement is that it's one thing then to put physical facilities in place. Yes, our objective, though, should be to have well-governed, well-maintained, well-managed residences, which provides an outstanding and excellent environment for these men and women to grow, to nurture, as the Minister points out. Moving in as adolescent is maybe a strong term, but moving in as a teenager into the university and becoming an adult and living in these conditions, in particular the bad conditions that I'm referring to, that's not great. We are teaching, we are creating the possibility here for these men and women to become leaders. Now, if we provide them accommodation of this kind, what are they? What's their experience going to be? What is the kind of leadership that we will receive from them? Yes, Caiaphas, the 240,000 rands is a bit shocking, especially if we look at the cost of a RDP house, right? And that is something that is a refrain in my own head. That I don't know what's the latest cost, Minister, maybe 30,000 state subsidy, maybe 50,000 to put up a basic infrastructure. The cost here includes obviously fittings. It includes the bed. It includes the so what we refer to by bed here is a single room. Let me use that term rather to avoid any further confusion. So the cost of a single room is about 240,000, and it includes the underlying infrastructure, water, electricity, and so on and so forth. And if you want further details, we can provide that to you, Minister.
Thanks, Prof. Of course, generally in our own discussions on infrastructure for higher education, we will also be looking at cheaper but more durable structures. It's something that also, for instance, I've asked the DG to look into. There's new technology that is emerging, also partly to see if we cannot lower the cost of doing this, including green buildings, by the way, apart from anything else. So those are the things that we will be looking into, which relates to this question that was being asked by Paula, is it? Yes. That what would be the things that we would want to regulate about? Those would be the ones, for instance. What's the cost? You can't just have, we know that universities negotiate, but also we'll have to have a standard by which you just don't get these exorbitant charges, by these private complex owners. Develop some kind of, as Professor is saying, benchmarking, something that we'll be looking into, of course, year in, year out, looking at costs. But safety is another one. That's a very, very serious issue. Whether there is enough or adequate security, there must be certain minimum standards. Accessibility to disabled students. That's another very important issue that we will have to regulate on, for example. Noise pollution. It's also an important matter. Some of these places are just in areas, really, that are completely not conducive to students to study. I'm thinking of Lonsdale, by the way, as an interest. It may be nice to be next to the beachfront, But even that, is it a good idea to have students in the beachfront every day? I don't know. Maybe I'm getting old, the issues, as I have said, of greening the environment, and governance. It's a very important matter, even in those privately owned residences, whether there is. We sometimes get report of shock treatment of students, by people who are in security there, and so on. So those would be some of the things. But of course, we will be, as we are studying this closely, be coming with something that we hope we'll publish first, for comment and engagement.
Just there's Appendix D in the report, which gives a kind of initial framework.
Yes. Appendix D, Professor Rensberg is pointing out to me, is giving some initial framework that you can actually look into as part of answering your question. Keifas, your question has been answered, I hope, satisfactorily.
Perhaps, Minister, if you don't mind me, apologies. Just on the question, Keifas, again, the 240,000 includes also common room areas. So it would include obviously ablution facilities. It would include dining facilities. It would include what do you call it? Lounge facilities. So that 240,000 is the average cost then across. I'm not saying it's the right number. I'm simply saying that out of the actual infrastructure costs as we speak now, all of those added up and then divided into the number of rooms, that's the outcome.
Yeah, Fanny, obviously students who fail, they do put more burden on the system in many ways than one. Apart from accommodation, they hold spaces for others who want to come in. So this, by the way, this report must not be seen in isolation from our broader strategy to improve throughput rates in our universities. And we had identified one of the reasons why we decided on such an extensive investigation is because this issue of residencies is one major contributory factor to high failure rates. So that is obvious. I would not like really to respond to what Professor van Staden might have said because I don't know. You know,
Jansen.
Oh, I thought it was van Staden. Oh, Jansen. Yeah, nevertheless, I'm sorry I didn't hear. I'm thinking about Walter Sisulu Digi, that's my problem, university. WSU, by the way, must be careful if there are negative problems, otherwise the Minister of Defense will be honest that we can't call that institution with its full names if we are talking about negative aspects about it, to protect the family name. It doesn't change that I wouldn't like to actually engage with Professor Jansen when I'm not sure what exactly he said and in what context. Other than to reiterate our stance as a government that we are a democracy, students have a right to demonstrate and protest, but they have no right to destroy property or engage in violence. We're going to act very hard on that because that's actually destroying property that do not only belongs to them but also belongs to future generations that actually come after them. We all have responsibilities. Government has its own responsibility and roles. You know, so is university management. They also have got their own role. If he was blaming us, I think that we mustn't, what is the right psychology word? Projection. You know, we mustn't blame each other. It doesn't help. You know, we are all in it together, really. I don't understand what we mean by government is not taking a strong line. Incidentally, by the way, university management also have a role to deal with problems as they arise and not blame us sometimes for their own shortcomings. You don't go around banning student organizations on campus and then come and complain to government to say government is not hard on student protests. You close down youth formations of political organizations, and then when you have a problem, you come and blame us. That's why we are saying we are all in it together. Thank you.
Minister, Pretoria, can we come over to you and take a few questions?
It seems like there are no questions in Pretoria.
Okay, Siyabonga, I think you had a question. Okay, thanks, Professor. We're coming back to Cape Town, Sia. And then, yeah, we'll come to you, and then we'll come to a follow-up from Paula, and then, okay.
Siyabonga Mkhwanazi from the New Age. Just wanted to find out what seems to be the problem of students, first-year students not getting accommodation from university. Is it because of what the minister was saying, that some students who fail, they hold up spaces for those who want to come in?
Thanks, yeah. Yes.
That I'm lucky. Mr. Minister, it's James Stein from Beeld speaking. I just, if I may, just some clarity on two issues and then a question. The clarity is regarding the 240,000 cost for a single room. I still think that figure sounds a little, abnormal. A RDP house at the moment is 55,000 rand for an entire house for a family of 4. So it just 240,000 just sounds ridiculous, to be absolutely blunt. Where was this figure? How did you come up with this figure? Did you get an independent body to come and say this is what the cost is? The second issue is regarding the regulation of private accommodation. just going through the Appendix D, the minimum standards code, it doesn't say anything that I could see regarding a basic fee tariff. If you just touched on that briefly, that you might look at saying that this is the amounts people will be allowed to charge students. If you could just touch on that, is that part of the plan? And is the plan to make this Appendix D code, is it going to be passed into law? Is it? I just want to get, if you could give me some clarity on that. And just then the last thing is just relating to abuse of accommodation. I myself am aware of some universities where a lot of money has been spent upgrading, fixing facilities, redoing entire accommodation blocks, and then the next year it has to be redone completely. I mean, is there, just if you could give us an idea of, where will there be some, so what will be done to prevent that? Because I do think there is a lot of abuse. People are given accommodation and they kick the doors off and they rip the faucets off, and nothing seems to happen. You can't get rid of them, can't get them out of the university. Is there going to be severe steps taken against people that abuse the property? Thank you.
Paula Charles. Just clarity on some of the numbers. I see it's estimated that in 2013 there'll be a backlog of 207,000 beds, which is, if my maths is correct, almost 200% of what you're offering in 2010. You're plowing in 3.8 billion rand, but that's not even, that's a shortfall of what is needed just to refurbish the already needed, the infrastructure that's already there. So, will the 3.8 billion help build new residences, or is that just going to be helping with the refurbishing of already of residents that are already there, or will there be additional funds to build new universities? I just want to be clear about what the 3.8 is going to be used for.
Just two issues. The first one is, it says here that about 20% of contact students are in residences. What is the ideal figure that you'd like to see? What is the ideal percentage for housing students? And then secondly, on the PIC, the funding provided by the PIC, do you have numbers as to how much is available for universities to access?
Who's going to take it first? Interesting that we're using the RDP house today as a benchmark for anything. I never thought we'd come to that. Over to you, Minister. Yes, there is a time constraint. I hope, Professor, you don't have anyone who's got a question there, because I'm going to suggest that we take that question with this batch, because this is going to be the last batch of questions.
Yes, we have one question here.
Can you please give us the question?
Good morning, Minister Carl Ganeski from Business Day.
Sound problem?
Hi, can you hear me now? Hello?
Is it fine?
Hi, Minister. Carl Ganeski from Business Day. Can you hear me? Yes, this backlog in quantity and quality comes as you are seeking to expand drastically higher education in South Africa, increase enrollment rates and access. You'd also mentioned that you'd been looking at international best practice. Did you learn anything looking at other countries on a way to, say, cost-effectively increase the quality and quantity of residences, and perhaps somehow utilize economies of scale in construction, perhaps take a very almost targeted approach to almost centralizing the process, which you don't approach it university by university on a university by university basis. Thanks.
That sits in Pretoria.
I wonder if, and I didn't get the question quite clearly. I know, oh, you got it. Okay, no, that's fine. Okay.
Sorry, I was hoping to do this in a one-on-one afterwards, but I have a request from my colleagues in Polokwane who have asked me to, it's not related, they've asked me to ask for your response to reports of FET teachers in the region who are not qualified, who are being hired, and some of them only have matric. Would you be able to respond to that, please?
Can I?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Abra from the SABC.
Thank you. Yes, the first-year students matter, Siyabonga, is a real puzzle. Firstly, our work suggests that in most institutions there is little planning. So in respect of student accommodation, there is no 5-year plan by way of example to indicate what, firstly, to understand what the trends are in enrollment across gender, across race profile, across disability profile, across seniority of students' profile. So that seems to be maybe one of the problems that we are confronted with here. The second problem is clearly when senior students continue to do well, and when you've got this limited number of beds, 107,000 odd, 7,598 beds in 2010, you're going to struggle to open up space for first years. I mean, that's the only logical explanation I can give you. Unless there is a definitive program that the institution has, I think we have the example here of Rhodes University. In its, we use it as one of the appendices there as a kind of benchmark report which universities should on a regular basis provide the Department of Higher Education and Training with. And in there is an analysis of their seniority, student seniority enrollment. So Rhodes is an example. I don't want to use my university as a specific example. I'm not here for that purpose. But the University of Johannesburg 2 years ago also made a decision that at least 40% of its first-year students should be in residence. And it was informed by this philosophy that, or not philosophy, yes in part, but also by this work that has been undertaken in the US, which suggests very strongly that spending 1 year, your first year in residence, increases significantly your chances of completing your qualification on time. And initial work in this respect has been done at Stellenbosch University, and the colleagues at Stellenbosch are quite confident about their own research that demonstrates that having a first year in res increases significantly the chance of completing the qualification on time. And so, Minister, I can't offer you logic except to say the absence of a planning model for institutions and perhaps inadequate attention from senior executives in our universities and councils for that matter to the matter of student accommodation. Again, James, we can provide you with the full detail of the 240,000 rands. Turning to private accommodation, again we speak or we address the issue at some length in the report. We spend some time reflecting firstly on public-private partnerships, the experience in respect of public-private partnerships, and how we, if that was to be pursued, as we recommend, how those can be fixed, how the existing PPPs can be remedied. And the big issue there in the existing PPPs in the university system in respect of student accommodation, the existing problem there is that it's the private sector that transfers all the risk to the university, and the university seemingly just signs off and accepts all the risk. So there's a fundamental problem in the way in which those agreements are structured, and we do make recommendations in that respect. But that's not where I want to go. I want to draw our attention to the private provision of student accommodation outside of PPPs and related arrangements. The Minister, in his press statement, drew our attention to the fact that as much as 53,000 beds are currently provided, 5 beds at a time, 10 beds at a time, 50 beds at a time, 100 beds at a time, 1,000 beds at a time. You see it in the report, the big providers we list in the report as well. So about 53,000 beds are currently provided by let's call it private entrepreneurs. Let me not use the word private sector. What we are saying in the report is that there is opportunity to expand those numbers of beds, and that in that manner we can reduce if you like, the commitment that we recommend the state should provide. So out of 207, what is that number that we said, 207,000 beds, we are of the view in this report that liability or that shortfall can be reduced by putting in place mechanisms to enable those small entrepreneurs, medium-sized entrepreneurs, to expand their provision. But clearly that will happen in the metropolitan areas, unlikely to happen in rural areas to any extent. Moving on, in my last point then, so what is the ideal? Again, the Minister speaks in his report, in his press statement. In the report on page 120, we address this matter. We speak there about a typology of South African higher education campuses. And what we do there is we offer a structure that speaks of type 1, type 2, and type 3 campuses. Type 1 campuses, as we say, there are those where campus accommodation off campus is unsuitable or unavailable. This would be, for example, University of Limpopo, University of Venda, University of Western Cape, University of Fort Alice. Those are just examples. Type 2 campuses are those where limited off-campus accommodation is available and is suitable. Rhodes University and Stellenbosch are 2 examples. And then type 3 campuses, these would be your metropolitan areas, UJ, WITS, UKZN, DUT, UCT are the examples that come to mind. And using that structure, we then propose that on type 1 campuses, that we should have, if you like, then a different target of accommodation. We say overall at least 50% of students should be in accommodation, university accommodation. But what we suggest in the report, recommend in the report, is that type 1 campuses, it should be 80%, because these are deep rural locations. They are unlikely, the private sector and private entrepreneurs are unlikely at this stage to be attracted and to take risk in those settings. And that in the so-called type 2 campuses, that the target should be 50%. Those are the 2 main groups that we focus on. We kind of argue in the report that type 3 are really institutions where the private entrepreneurs and PPPs and so on, Minister, can play a much more significant role in those centers. And using that formula then, we arrive at that table on page 121 and 122, which gives us then the immediate 2010 shortfall estimated at just under 200,000 beds, and that in summary is then the proposal in respect of what is the ideal number of students who should be accommodated. I should just finally say, Minister, that I think we need to acknowledge that as the system grows over the next decade, over the next 2 decades, it is more likely that low-income, first-generation, and in particular women students, are going to be the ones that are going to constitute the majority or the largest section of that growth. And so the situation is not going to improve, Minister, over the next decade to 2 decades. It's going to worsen, and is going to therefore require an innovative intervention, but a definitive and a determined intervention to break the back of this backlog challenge in front of us.
No, thank you, Mphathisi. On the PIC, our discussions with the PIC, we've been engaging for quite some time now. And what then we seem to be converging around at the present moment is that it could be quite useful to start the fund at around 8 billion rands. Of course, that still has to be finalized in the processes of the PIC itself. But it doesn't end there. I think what is also important is that the banks should also come on board in putting up preferential rates for this exercise, because it's a huge responsibility for the country. And also as part of their social responsibility, it becomes quite important that we mobilize all the resources, of the country to actually address this question. Because the CEOs that are there, executives, and I suppose all of us here have studied in these institutions, and we've got a responsibility then to ensure that they become institutions whereby our youth is going to learn quite productively in conducive circumstances. So it's not just a matter for government, it's a matter for the country and for everybody. So we really ask for that understanding and commitment from the private sector as well in addressing the shortage of accommodation in our institutions. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe just quickly to pick up on a few issues that questions that were directed to me, maybe, and comment on others. Look, the first thing is that the figure of 240,000, maybe by way of addition, is an average. It will vary from area to area. In some areas, obviously, if you go to Umtata, for instance, it may cost far less than university accommodation in Johannesburg, as a matter of fact. And also benchmarking is very important. It's a very important issue. I'm not so sure whether the RDP house is the proper benchmark. Some of the RDP houses that I can think of, for instance. And also what is required in a student room. What do you require in a room that is going to be used by the students? Obviously, this is a matter we'll be looking very closely at, the issue of cost, which is something, by the way, that the President himself, in his State of the Nation address in so many ways, and the Minister of Finance much more specifically, also to be looking at the issue of cost, especially for services or provision to government, because in many instances we've been taken to the cleaners. At least what Professor Rensberg and his team have done is to give us the figures in terms of assessing of what is required and so on at going rates. Yes, we will have to find a way of having a kind of regulatory regime that's also going to monitor costs from private providers to institutions. Universities, they do that, they negotiate all the time. But we need to have oversight over that. It's going to be very important in order to avoid, you see now in quite a number of metropolitan areas, people buying derelict buildings, desperately and seeking to target students and doing practically very little to improve them and then hoping to make a killing out of that. We have to have a regulatory thing, including legislation where necessary. If legislation is required in order to do this, we will, of course, table legislation before Parliament. The issue of destruction of property, as I have said, is completely unacceptable. It's illegal. It's a criminal offense. And we have to approach it that way. Of course, it is very important, as I say, We do on our side engage all stakeholders on an ongoing basis, student formations in particular, around talking around the problems so that we actually avoid instances of even boycotts of lectures where we can, because it's not ideal at all. So talking is very important. But at the same time, we will act as government against acts of vandalism that we see that are completely. We have acted on those. You know, institutions themselves, by the way, not even government, let alone government, institutions themselves have acted. I am told, for instance, that of the students who have been arrested and have been charged at UKZN for recent disturbances, 2 of them are not even students, by the way. Because also there is an element which is exploiting this for whatever reason. They aren't even students. Some of them are professional students who are in their 8th, 9th year doing a 3-year degree. Something that we support the institutions to act very strongly against that. You know, being a student, a full-time student can't be a permanent occupation, really. Yes, being a student is a permanent thing because we all must learn throughout our lives. But to be a permanent student, it really can't be something that we can accept. Yes, Paula, we do have financial challenges. We must admit. Government does not all have the resources. Our task, and I think we've been quite creative, by the way, as a department in many respects, is how best do we use resources that are in our hands maximally, because they are competing. Do you put more money into the National Student Financial Aid Scheme or more into residences, for example? It's a very serious policy choice, given the fact that we don't. Yes, you can put as much money into the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, but if you are driving students to some of this accommodation that is being spoken about there, you're wasting that money. Because those students are just going to fail. We are just going to increase failure rates. So you actually need to balance on that. Where I'm seeing some hands, unfortunately I'll have to be excused if the professor, I haven't finished. If Professor Rensbeck and the DG can stay, otherwise I'm in trouble in terms of my 10 o'clock meeting. But just on a few other things, that is why we are looking at other sources of funding. Very seriously. We are looking at other sources of funding. And as we get more funds, we will be able to address that. Yeah, I don't think we should be approaching a PW Porter type of approach to student protests, much as we must be firm. You know, this thing of scope, skid, and donor. We must be firm and act against this, but the solution is multi-pronged. We must also engage in this, because in some instances there are genuine problems. Institutions that engage usually are able sometimes to just sit down and engage, you know. But as we say, we condemn violence and destruction of property. We will act firmly as we have done. I think Professor Rensbeck has spoken about ideal figures as contained in the report. It's something that we will continue to be looking at. Ideally, we should have no shortage of student accommodation for all students in residential universities. You know, that is the and also I think Professor Rensbeck, is it Carl or Charles from Business Day? Yes. Look, there are. Oh, you mean on well, when I leave, you can come back to that on international best practice, because you are actually better placed to do that. But we are on our side. You know what we can say is that we are looking at other creative ways of addressing this, which will, by the way, lead to the question on the FET colleges. As a department, also, we are beginning to advance the concept of student villages. For example, in a particular area where you have an FET college and a university, You know, you should actually aim to build student villages that will accommodate both. In fact, it's healthy even. There are many advantages of doing that, putting college students and university students together. As part of creative accounting, as part of creative response to the challenge that we face. I didn't know there's outsourcing in the media, that a colleague of yours can outsource to you to ask about FET colleges in Limpopo. Look, very briefly on this issue, we can come back to it if you want us to. You can talk also to the DG. One of the key aspects of the turnaround strategy for FET colleges is the issue of college lecturers. We have already started, by the way, with some programs of dedicated training of college lecturers. We are aware of this issue, that it's a very critical dimension of our strategy to raise the quality of lecturers. You will also remember, you may recall, last year we signed a national skills accord with labor, business, community representatives as government, where we had agreed that over and above what we do as government in terms of upgrading FET college lecturers, employers are also going to open their workplaces for these lecturers to get exposure in the latest technologies, for instance, that are being used in industry as part of raising their qualifications. Incidentally, in Limpopo also, it's a matter, by the way, just like the Eastern Cape, but Limpopo, you will be aware that education is under Section 100B. We are now, as the Department of Higher Education and Training, centrally responsible for FET colleges directly, as from the announcement of this administration for FET colleges. And we are engaging with all of them, and there's excitement around that. And we are also identifying areas for immediate intervention in order to try and turn around those colleges as part of a broader national strategy. I will have to be excused. I must apologize. Please write about what we're talking about, not the fact that I left you whilst it was still being nice being with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. The DG, unfortunately, also has to go to a portfolio committee engagements. No, the DG. So what I was going to suggest is that maybe you send us follow-up questions, or you are left behind and engage directly with the Vice-Chancellor. Thank you for honoring this engagement. Goodbye.